Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, February 28th, last day of February, right? Not a leap year this year. February 28th, 2023. Time for another show. Time for another day of the month, if it were. Next year, I guess. Next year about this time. Or more or less exactly this time. We'll be talking about how there's another day tomorrow. I don't know whether we'll remember to make mention of it, but the fact will be true. Anyway, who cares about true fact? We can always just turn to Fox News, I suppose. Fox very much in the news today. I guess their court case, or the Dominion court case against them, continues apace. We'll see if we can get an update. And I guess last we were reading, it was the what did we say? Not directed verdict, but summary judgment motions by Dominion Voting Systems, making pleadings that as a matter of law, they ought to be, Fox ought to be found liable to them for defamation, which is, I would say, probably a rare outcome to win on summary judgment just because the bar is so high. I'm fairly sure that most cases, I would guess, I should say. I'm not fairly sure. I would guess that most cases judges will say, well, yeah, you know, I mean, you're almost there, but there's no reason not to give a jury a chance on this thing, especially with such a high bar. And then it's not my fault if everything is screwed up. As I understand it, Fox, too, has not only answered Dominion's filings, but filed their own motion for summary judgment, which probably just in general, defendants probably win on summary judgment on a defamation suit more often, I would guess, because it's easier to say, well, you haven't met this bar than that you have. So for some reason, that seems easier for judges. But at any rate, that's not what is at the center of the material that's emerging. There is another story that may or may not ever really have an impact on the courtroom liability for Fox. But, excuse me, nonetheless, probably the more important news for us. Like, for instance, there's reporting out today, and I've got some tucked away in pocket, that, as we know, the disclosures made by, on the Fox side during discovery, and then, of course, under questioning their executives in depositions. This is coming out piece by piece, that it seems fairly obvious that the story that's being told here is that inside Fox News and behind closed doors in Fox News, not only did the executives, but the on-air personalities all basically agreed that A, Trump had lost the election, B, that most if not all of the conspiracy theories being floated by the Trump team that attempted to explain away the loss or claim a win were not true, and that certainly that the involvement of Dominion voting systems, that particular conspiracy theory, I think, was rejected almost universally by Fox executives and on-air personalities when speaking amongst themselves. But of course, they were devoting almost all of their airtime during this critical period to airing those conspiracy theories anyway, and hinting darkly that they actually thought that they might be true rather than actually false. So as we discussed last time we went through this story, it calls into question not only, of course, their status as a news organization, but also their protection for their what they call, or what they refer to as their opinion side when they're trying to defend themselves against lawsuits, by saying, well, the opinion reporters, they of course are freed from having to adhere strictly to the facts. They're giving their opinions, you see, on these things. But as it turns out, this is an interesting twist on these kinds of cases. I don't know whether judges will allow juries to consider things this way. But anyway, strong logical argument being made that, well, your opinions are the ones being expressed here in private, but there's also, you leave behind evidence that you refuse to deliver your actual opinion of what's going on the air. So are you really an opinion network even? But it gets still worse. Now, the New York Times coverage of things that I have at hand focuses still, I think, on the last week side of the story. This time, I guess they have Rupert Murdoch on the stand giving a deposition. And Murdoch and his testimony more or less confirms what we learned last week. The headline for the New York Times piece is Murdoch acknowledges Fox News hosts endorsed election fraud falsehoods. The subheader makes things, I guess, a little bit clearer. Rupert Murdoch, the conservative media mogul, spoke under oath last month in a $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit against Fox by Dominion Voting Systems. You knew who was suing who, but why was he speaking? Speaking under oath in a deposition in preparation for this case. And, we learn essentially that though he's worried about it at the time and regrets it in hindsight, he was pretty clear that not only was the stuff untrue, but that Fox News hosts, he says he used the word, endorsed these election fraud falsehoods. Now, there's another story circulating, and I don't know if I'm sure I'll find links to the original reporting, but you'll find it if you're up and reading this morning at Daily Kos. Hunter's front page story, the more, perhaps the more explosive, if not necessarily the more impactful of the two stories and of the two frauds that were going on, or the many frauds that were going on. Fox News delivered unreleased Biden campaign ads to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now that is really something. And but it's interesting. I'm not certain that it will play in the defamation context, but it certainly would be evidence that would undermine any of their claims to be a regular news organization. I guess you should keep in mind, and I guess this is how it plays in. And mind you, I'm not a lawyer on this case. I don't know what their strategy is. But the Fox defense to, rough morning today. All right. The Fox defense to the charges of defamation in chief will be, well, we're a news network. We were delivering either what we believed to be the news, or even if we were delivering what we believed not to be the news, we have a First Amendment right to deliver it. And Fox continues to thrive despite the fact that it's now been many years since they were forced to admit that, yes, they sometimes lie on the air and tell untruth about what's in the news, but they are, after all, entitled to do so under the First Amendment. The First Amendment doesn't require that journalists and news organizations tell the truth. It requires that there be no ability of the government to crack down on them for the content of their speech within certain limits. Anyway, so who cares, I guess you might ask, or what's the connection? It's obviously sounds like a bad thing to do. The headline, Fox News delivered unreleased Biden campaign ads to Kushner, right? Totally unfair, but didn't we just say that they could be liars and cheats and thieves? Well, not really, but, liars, yes. Cheats, thieves, all right. Well, that's a separate problem. And then, I guess that gets right to it. It might be that they are interested in going to the claims that, well, a news organization that was simply, whether they were fair and balanced or not, as you claim in your tagline, a news organization has there's a certain fiduciary responsibility to your advertising clients. Yeah, not to reveal the content of those ads or the ad airing, the airing strategy and the times and the rotations and the heavy, how often will these ads play? All of those things are internal strategy, and they're of course entrusted to the news, well, to the television networks, so that they air. You want to buy 10 ads, you're going to have to tell the television station that you want the 10 ads and when you want them, and then pay them for it. What they're supposed to do, of course, is keep that information more or less in confidence, as they would for any client, and not, if you're Acme Roadrunner traps, for instance, and you're advertising, they're not supposed to call the competition for Roadrunner traps, and we never find out who they are. Acme more or less appeared to have a monopoly on these things. Probably should have been hit with an antitrust suit, but that was probably more complex a concept than they felt was necessary to convey during the Saturday morning cartoons. But you get the idea. You're not supposed to call up, AAA Roadrunner traps and tell them what Acme is doing because you like them better or anything of the sort. People are just supposed to compete out there. And, but perhaps more to the point for Dominion, and we'll see. Eventually we'll read what Hunter wrote here, because, he's a smart guy and a good writer, and we might want to depend on him to deliver the news. But I'm here and I'm talking, and he's not saying anything. He doesn't fill any time at all. But what I think the value for Dominion is, they may say, well, remember that the Fox defense here is that as a news organization, they have a First Amendment right to, lie their asses off and tell stories about election fraud if they want to. But two other things are happening. One, in chief, you would say, are you a news organization? I mean, look at what you're doing. A news organization that was, fair and balanced and just reporting the news wouldn't be weighing in on the side of one candidate or another like this and giving away the secrets of one campaign to the other campaign. That's part of it. And then, of course, I guess there's some disconnect there too, where they might say, Fox News really shouldn't be getting that sort of information, or, you shouldn't be directing the news with the business side. Most of these Fox ad buys weren't, probably not even on Fox News Network. They were on the Fox, the regular television network, broadcast Fox stations and the networks of them around the country. The people that air The Simpsons and NFL football and stuff like that. But of course, it all comes under the same ownership umbrella. And you might wonder sometimes how well the executives compartmentalize and separate themselves. I may have a news bias, I may have a political bias, but I can't let that weigh in and get in the way of our relationship with clients. I can't defraud our advertising clients on behalf of other advertising clients because I have a political inclination that way. And then when you get caught doing that, it's good. I would guess it would probably, in the mind of jurors, make it more difficult to hide behind a First Amendment defense if you weren't actually practicing, the tenets of journalism, for instance. All right, let's see how Hunter puts this, I think, more amazing aspect of the story that I really didn't see reflected in the Times article I was reading today, although I'm sure they must have reported on the story. And indeed, he does link to those stories. Is it the same story? Let's see. Fox News Dominion Rupert Murdoch is the URL. Yeah, he's using the same URL. So my skim of the story didn't hone in on this, and I guess that means you could probably say they buried it a little bit in this story. Let's see how Hunter extracts it. Details from the Dominion voting system's deposition of Fox News chair Rupert Murdoch are now coming out, and once again, it shows that the Fox executive suites were all fully aware that their on-air hosts were, quote, endorsing hoaxes about the 2020 presidential election that they knew to be false. Rupert Murdoch himself admitted he was aware that several of his hosts were promoting the hoaxes, including Jeanine Pirro, Sean Hannity, and Lou Dobbs, and Murdoch was even willing to allow that Fox executives should, quote, maybe got rid of, if it was proven that they knew the network was airing lies. Okay, good news on that front. In another part of the materials just released as part of Dominion's response to a Fox News motion for summary judgment, and now we're switching over to I think a different New York Times piece. Now that I'm looking at it, he's linking elsewhere when it comes to the stuff I find the juiciest, at least this morning. So as I was saying, good news on that front. In another part of the materials just released as part of the Dominion's response to Fox's motion for summary judgment. As I said, they did it too. We learned that ex-House Speaker Paul Ryan, who is on the Fox News board of directors, directly told both Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch that, quote, these conspiracy theories were baseless, and that, quote, Fox News should not be spreading conspiracy theories. That would seem to preclude any executive excuses on the subject. From the board of directors to the Murdoch family itself, the bigwigs knew full well that their hosts were spreading election lies. Dominion continues to have Fox News dead to rights on this one. It's difficult to prove defamation lawsuits, but Dominion's $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit against Fox has featured a mountain of evidence to prove that Fox News' on-air pundits knew full well that accusations of fraud using Dominion's voting machines were hoaxes. There's another tantalizing tidbit. Now we move on to the good stuff in Dominion's filing as well. Media Matters senior fellow Matthew Gertz singled out a section in which Rupert Murdoch appears to confirm that when Joe Biden's Joe Biden presidential campaign purchased advertisements on Fox News, probably, I guess, even though that was probably ill-advised, Fox News during the campaign, Murdoch provided Trump White House advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner with, quote, confidential information about Biden's ads, along with debate strategy. Now, I have not yet read exactly what that's supposed to mean, debate strategy. I find it hard to believe that there was real debate strategy in their hands as a result of advertising on the, I don't know. Let's take a look. There's a clip here directly from, I guess, Gertz's write-up or via his Twitter account, at any rate. During Trump's campaign, Rupert provided Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, with Fox confidential information about Biden's ads along with debate strategy. Okay, well, this is just quoting out of, he's quoting Gertz's write-up, but Gertz, I guess, is quoting the filings directly. Let's see. So this, as an example, they cite the Rupert Murdoch deposition, providing Kushner a preview of Biden's ads before they were public. And, this is just a notation, where to look in the deposition and what you're looking for. But on election night, Rupert would not help with the Arizona call, that is for when Fox News analysts eventually and correctly made the call that Joe Biden would win Arizona and therefore the presidency. And they called the Trump campaign, Kushner personally and other campaign officials called Fox News higher-ups, and I think probably it is revealed here, Rupert Murdoch directly, to prevail upon him in personal terms. I want you to go in there and change that call, make them take that back and keep our hopes alive. But apparently Rupert would not help them with that, and that's good for everybody, including himself, for his own defense. As Rupert described it, my friend Jared Kushner called me saying, this is terrible, and I could hear Trump's voice in the background shouting. That's kind of funny. But Rupert refused to budge, and I said, well, the numbers are the numbers. By this point, Rupert knew no fraud had occurred. Okay, so again, sort of establishing his personal knowledge and understanding of the fact that these conspiracy theories and lies were just that, lies. We've long argued, Hunter returns in his voice, that Democratic candidates should not appear on the hoax-boosting propaganda network calling itself Fox News. But this is evidence that Democratic candidates should never, ever advertise on Fox either. Not just don't appear, Don't buy ads. That's really true. Biden's campaign may have purchased ads on the network, but Rupert Murdoch turned around and delivered those ads to the Trump team before they aired. The clip that we used from Matt Gertz's write-up here, quite honestly, yeah, I don't know why we begin this topic and then go back to his clip. He doesn't really address this stuff, at least in the clip that's used. But at any rate, this is the more important, I think, of the two things. Biden's campaign purchased ads on the network, but Rupert Murdoch personally turned around and delivered those ads to the Trump team before they aired. That's probably not illegal, though it might possibly, perhaps, you might be able to argue that Murdoch's delivery of confidential Biden campaign information was making an in-kind campaign contribution to Trump's campaign. I would argue that it probably violates some fiduciary duties that would create some civil liability. Yeah, I don't know whether it creates any sort of criminal liability, unless it's, I guess at this point you might consider just alleging that the whole operation is a fraud from top to bottom and has been defrauding everybody, including advertisers, like putting themselves forward as being a business concern that in exchange for collecting fees will air your ads regardless of content unless they violate community standards in some way. That is a fraudulent proposition, that they were never an honest broker of advertising space, that they were instead abusing their position to leak to preferred clients the corporate or, in this case, electoral strategy of the other ones. So that one, that should destroy any of their, or at least seriously call into question any of their First Amendment claims, as whether as a news network or just as a public communications channel of some sort. No, you're not operating in good faith under the under the tenets of the First Amendment and free speech, and so you're not therefore entitled to protections under it. You're instead using them as a shield to protect your criminal or at least tortious interference with everybody else's dealings. And I would draw an analogy here to we've been discussing over the last couple of days a lot of the dynamics of the crime fraud exception to various claims of privilege. Similarly, you ought to be able to pierce the veil here of First Amendment protections. Those are for news gathering networks, journalists, and I guess various other public communicators, even those that are not involved in journalism or politics or political coverage. But, you should have a certain freedom of expression under free speech rules under the First Amendment. But if you're actually just using the shield of the First Amendment to cloak criminal or fraudulent activity, holding yourself out as a neutral broker of advertising space, but in fact not only putting your thumb on the scale, but using these claims of being a neutral dealer of advertising space to lure in advertisers who believe that you'll hold their strategies in confidence, but in fact you're simply collecting their money, cashing their checks, and then double dipping by selling that information, whether for cash or anything else, to the competition, the advertiser's competition. I think you could construct a fairly significant fraud case out of that at some point. But anyway, as we left off, it's probably not illegal, though it is possible that, and that is another way of looking at it, that it would be an in-kind contribution to the Trump campaign by the network. But it's definitely crooked for a supposed news network, Hunter concludes, and yet more proof that even as Fox pretends that being a journalistic outfit, it operates as a for-profit arm of the Republican Party's campaign machine. Probably a valid conclusion there, too. And I would hope at some point this spells the end to the weird proclivity of actual journalists, professional journalists, to pretend that Fox News really is a regular journalism outfit, and we should stop talking about the fact that they lean conservative as a reason for excluding them from the community of journalists. But perhaps these revelations, one, the insistence that the content of their broadcasts were untrue, but that they were going with them anyway. Two, the sale of or exchange of confidential information from advertisers. So on the business side, they're corrupt. On the news side, they're corrupt. On the opinion side, they're corrupt. They're not delivering their actual opinions. They're delivering what they know what they know to be false news, and they aren't even fair brokers of advertising space. There's really no aspect of a television network, a licensed, federally licensed television network. I mean, maybe that's the avenue you want to go to. None of the characteristics of a normal television network are present here. Not in the news division, not in the commercial division, and not on the opinion side of the news operation. Nowhere are they actually conducting themselves according to what's supposed to be the rules and norms of this business. And so, maybe the license and that bandwidth should belong to someone else entirely. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our first segment, and none too soon. Time to see what we can do about clearing the pipes a little bit in the 2-minute break, and then on to other areas of the news, and then, of course, laying the groundwork for discussing perhaps other subjects. We'll check in and see what Joan McCarter has on her plate in our last segment. We'll be right back after these brief messages, which are mostly probably from me.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Shoo, okay. Well, just searching around and looking to keep an eye out for what else might be hot this morning. Returning to Pocket to bring forward a couple of other interesting and weird ideas. Let's see. I think what I put this away for. This was kind of astonishing the other day, and I didn't get to this too, but Rick Hasen treats it as a relatively quick hit in his election law blog, but this is another one of those topics that, like Hunter's article, it's in fact a quick hit, but could be discussed for, hours and on end, but certainly at great length. So at his election law blog, which you can find at electionlawblog.org, by the way, this story from, I guess this got recirculated in the, I don't know why, in the wake of something, but I'm not certain what, and I didn't put away the Mastodon toot, I imagine, which is what I think directed me to it, but I now, I'm looking at the date on it. It's a December 30th, 2022 piece, so not, the distant past. But still, end of last year, prior to New Year's. So I don't know what brought this back up, and I don't think I saw this the first time around. Just sort of interesting. Is a part of the legal background here. Cleta Mitchel. You remember Cleta Mitchel? I believe the reason this was being circulated again, I'm not certain about the timing, but now I recall having seen it be circulated again with somebody saying, yeah, Cleta Mitchel is angling for a future Trump administration, should he return to office, nomination to, well, I'm sure she hopes the Supreme Court. She may be a little older than the people that Republicans ordinarily nominate to the Supreme Court these days. The practice being to nominate younger and younger people, probably in both parties, nominating younger and younger people who will sit on the court for even longer. But certainly somewhere in the federal judiciary, they would find a place for Cleta Mitchel. But some wild legal theories being circulated here. Cleta Mitchel, in the January 6th committee deposition, expresses the view that the old Electoral Count Act, the one prior to the tinkering that went on at the end of last year, that the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional, which by itself doesn't tell us a great deal, because, of course, you may recall that Armando likewise thinks that there are at least parts of the old Electoral Count Act that were unconstitutional. But what does she mean by unconstitutional? Is it the same thing that he's thinking of? No, probably not. But Cleta Mitchel tells the January 6th committee that the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional and that legislatures have absolute power over electors, and that the people's vote for president is just advisory. It's an interesting way of looking at it. And on a strict reading of some portions of the Constitution, I suppose you could make the argument for it. But then again, there are certain arguments that might be made against it, i.e., tar and feathers, for instance. Yes, your reading of this provision of the Constitution could be true. There's nothing that establishes firmly that it absolutely cannot be true, but it is also the sort of position and interpretation that the founders were quite familiar, could get you dunked in hot tar, covered with feathers, and ridden out of town on a rail, and that's the limitation. And get used to it. You know, if it's good enough for the founders, maybe it's good enough for us. Anyway, let me tell you what exactly is going on here. Rick Hasen grabs this piece from the transcript of Cleta Mitchel's deposition. Amazing portion, as he says, from pages 20 and 21 of her deposition, if you happen to have those pages in front of you. And it begins this way, with her answering a question, I guess offering some additional editorializing, because the clip begins with her saying, "Let me make something very clear." And the questioner says, yes. And the answer, Q&A is how things are labeled here. The answer, of course, coming from Cleta Mitchel. The Constitution of the United States grants plenary power, or if you prefer plenary, power to state legislatures to choose the electors of the state. And I think I would have to agree that it certainly offers the legislature the opportunity to decide how that state's electors will be chosen. As it happens, at this point in history, and for most of our history, I think I could venture to say, most states have said the only widely acceptable method of determining who the state's electors should be at this point is to have a general election, and in the general election ask people whether they wish to have us appoint electors for candidate from this party or electors from the candidate from that party, or occasionally a few other parties as well, and that the winner of the popular vote in that state is the one who wins the state's electors. But it does seem clear from the writing of the Constitution that the state the state legislature could opt for a different method. Probably they imagined the other method being that the state legislature might appoint electors on behalf of the state, which was not, it seems ridiculous, of course, but it wasn't quite, I'm sure, as wild an idea at the time, especially before the 17th Amendment for direct election of senators. I don't remember what the number of the amendment is, but I think that might actually be right. But before then, of course, state legislatures appointed senators, United States senators, and there was no opportunity for voters. Yeah, it is the 17th Amendment. Good for you. Not up to the voters of the state to elect who represented them in the Senate. So, there was room for this, but it just wasn't the typical practice. So, that, and then, of course, as we've said before, well, they could say coin toss, drawing lots, whatever. They could say such things, but the usual two options would have been either appointment by the legislature or, and I guess what Cleta Mitchel is saying is it still ends up being appointment by the legislature. It's just that they're taking their cues from the popular vote instead. But I think that most states have actually written their legislatures out of the process entirely, that they're just saying we, essentially designate that task or assign that task to the people, and that the results of the election are determinative as to who will get the governor's commission, essentially, as delegates to the Electoral College. So anyway, this is the way she puts it. The Constitution grants plenary power to the state legislatures to choose the electors of the state. Congress has enacted a statute, which is an enabling law. I guess here the Electoral Count Act. It's interesting. There's a little bit of confusion already. I mean, Congress has enacted an enabling statute to count the votes of the Electoral College and how that will be done. But the congressional enabling statute isn't the one that authorizes the winners of the election in each state as the endorsees to the delegates to the Electoral College on behalf of each state. It's not the Congressional Enabling Act that did that. That's those would be state legislative acts deciding how they will appoint their electors. So it's already a little confused. I'll point that out. So Congress has enacted a statute which is an enabling law, which I happen to think is unconstitutional because that power granted in the Constitution to the state legislatures is complete and total. There's nothing in the Constitution about allowing people, citizens, to vote on electors. And I think to that extent it's true. But then why throw in the red herring about Congress and its enabling statute? All they're doing is enabling the counting of votes or the verification of the count of the votes of the members of the Electoral College duly selected according to state law by the various states. It's just that all 50 states have given over their selection process to the general election and the voters. Can they change that? They can, but then they stand to be ousted by the voters, not to mention tarred and feathered. Now, she goes on to say, that is something that legislatures have over time decided they want to do, that is, to give people the right to determine who the electors will be by popular ballot. But in my view, according to the Constitution, that's an advisory role that happens because the legislature has created a mechanism to conduct the election. Whereas, in my view, that is not entirely an abdication of power, but it is a pre-existing social contract with the people of the state. We will allow you to determine who the electors should be. And if we revoke it after the fact, after we've promised you that you will be able to choose the electors, and then instead we say we reject your judgment and after the fact revoke your right to make that decision, I think that's where it really becomes invalid. Could a state legislature decide ahead of time, in 2023, for instance, that yes, come 2024, here in Arizona, the legislature will be appointing the electors, and there will be no presidential balloting on the general election ballot in November of 2024. And if you declare that ahead of time, it may be too late to do anything about it, to elect a new legislature to revoke that law. It might just be the case that you're stuck with it. You could be angry. You might decide to tar and feather your elected representatives. I don't know. But could they do it ahead of time? Yes. Could they do it after the fact, after they've told people they'll have the chance to vote? In my view, probably no. Although, it's not clear from the text of the Constitution why that might be. It's just sort of, I think, part of the understood social contract of, you pass a law, you've got to kind of honor it until the law is changed, or suppose a judge in a court of competent jurisdiction instructs you that your interpretation has been wrong all along. They could do that with Republican judges, I suppose, but on what basis? Well, if you can't establish a solid one, then the judges, I guess, get the tar as well. Anyway, so that's her view, that it's the legislatures have decided that they want to determine who will be their electors by popular vote, though they could change that, and it's a question of when they could, when it would be a valid exercise of their power to do so. She continues and says, assuming that that mechanism is carried out in accordance with the statutes that the legislature has enacted to make it possible for the citizens to weigh in and make their voices heard, then the legislature can use or choose to use what the people have decided. But that's not in the Constitution. So again, it's her view that they could say, oh yes, we will adopt a law that says that the people shall vote, and the winner of that vote gets the right to call themselves members of the Electoral College. But if we find out later that we don't like the results for whatever reason, we have the right to do something completely different. Well, I would say that has to be in the enabling statute. If the enabling statute that provides for the election says, and by the way, we reserve to ourselves the right to throw out the results and to treat them as merely advisory, I think that would have to be spelled out explicitly in the enabling legislation. She doesn't. She thinks that because the Constitution grants states the rights to determine the manner of the elections, the manner of the selection of its delegates to the Electoral College, that they can revoke their promise after the fact. Whereas I say, okay, the Constitution gives the state legislatures the chance to make that declaration, and they have. It also, I will note for the record, I suppose, does not say anything about changing their minds or taking second bites at the apple. If it is by act of the legislature that they establish that an election is the method by which the Electoral College delegates will be named, and then they purport to name different ones by a different method, I would ask, by what authority do you do so? The Constitution gives you plenary power, but plenary power to act openly as a legislature, not to say, I think that the interpretation of our action is wrong and we're just going to reverse it. You could put that out clause in your enabling legislation so that everybody could see it and hold you to account for passing something so ridiculous, but you can't pretend it's in there just because the Constitution says you have the power in the first instance to determine the methodology. It doesn't say anything about changing your mind later. You see what I'm saying? All right. Anyway, she goes on to say, and so I think that is one of the things that we hadn't really, as a country, we haven't focused on that. But that is what the Constitution says. So it's not like picking an alternate slate of electors. Well, see what she's trying to excuse here? the people who did, in fact, turn around and send alternate slates of electors. That's not what we're doing. We're exercising the state's plenary power, the legislature's plenary power, to make that determination for ourselves, even though we promised everybody in statute that you would be making the decision. I still think even if the state legislature had sent those slates, they would still be wrong and still be acting unconstitutionally. But I'll point out also that it was not in any case the state legislature that sent any of these alternative slates. So it is like sending an alternative slate of electors. And it is like someone who was not even authorized by state law to do it, did it. Because that's what happened. And she seems to be glossing over that, which is kind of major. So as she says, it's not like picking an alternate slate of electors. The legislature has the authority to choose the electors, and they don't have to ask anybody's permission, in my view. And I think in your view might get you tarred and feathered, but also lose in court. And that's my position. And I think that that's what the Constitution says. And I think there's ample authority to support that view. Now, you may have a different view, but we're lawyers, and we're both entitled to read the law in the way that we think is appropriate. Well, that's true. But, I'm not going to tar and feather you. I'm a lawyer. All I do is argue against you. Now, when people find out what your position is, if they tar and feather you, I can't help that. I might object to it. As an officer of the court, I would say, this is not an endorsed action of the court or of law. This is extrajudicial proceedings. Yes, but that won't help you any. The tar will still be hot. Now, they might come. Sure, the opportunity is there for them to tar and feather me for saying that they ought to actually have a voice in selecting the president. But I like the odds as to who gets tarred and feathered. If someone's going to get it and the crowd's angry, I'd rather be on the side of saying, yes, the crowd gets to determine what it wants, than the other way around. On the other hand, you probably feel safe because one of the weird things about an angry mob is sometimes it can be non-representative, and it can be all Fox News viewing Cleta Mitchel fans who show up with the tar too. That's bad news for me, but so long as it's actually consulting with the electorate, the full electorate, the odds are better for me than for Cleta. So there you go. I don't think people, she says, ought to be massacred or put in jail or disbarred because they have a different legal view than you do. I also think that, but sometimes crowds don't. That's all I can tell you about that one. Anyway, that is fairly astonishing and quite a weird reading of the Constitution. And I think one that's, like I said, I think it's answerable by the same textual analysis, right? It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that there's any right of the people to be heard on or vote on who the president should be. That's true. It gives that power to the states. But when the states use their authority to enact a statute that says that the people will vote and the people's vote will be determinative, then you're bound by that statute. You can't just change your mind later, even though the power was in your hands in the first instance. You chose to exercise it. It says that you'll have the power to determine the manner of elections, and you have. It doesn't say anything about there being a secondary power to redetermine them if you don't like the way they came out the first time. That could be done in your enabling statute, but no one's done it, as far as I can tell. I suppose, with the exception of states, as I recall, some states argued, well, we do have an emergency provision where if some sort of natural disaster or other emergency has rendered the results indeterminative, or indeterminate. I don't know what's the right construction for that. But if you are willing to declare as a matter of law that the election was so impacted by natural disaster, fraud, interference, invasion, what have you, that it should be nullified. There were some states that said they had that right by the enabling statute that they had adopted. But no state legislature in any case actually came forward and said that that was the truth. They all flirted with it or they were asked to do it by the Trump administration and Cleta Mitchel, but nobody agreed to do it. For some strange reason, in the court of public opinion, Cleta Mitchel's view of the plenary power of the state legislatures was rejected unanimously in all 50 states. Who knows what they might have done with more time to consider her request, but what can I tell you? It was brought to them under a restricted time, time conditions here. And under pressure, 0 legislatures agreed to her interpretation or to accept her invitation to act. So that doesn't mean they always will react the same way. But in the situation she's describing, she has 0 support. What does she say? At the end, she says, they don't have to ask anybody. What's the point? Oh, yes, right. I think there's ample authority to support her view, she says. Well, there's certainly no evidence that anybody else agrees that there's ample authority to support that view. They were asked to do so and they wouldn't because they didn't believe they had that authority. Because I think the better interpretation is, well, we have the right to select the manner of election, and we did that, and that's kind of the end of our authority on the matter. Though we can change our mind in advance of the next election, we can't change our mind after the fact regarding this election. It seems like a pretty basic construction of enabling statutes in my view. Anyway, I thought that was rather amazing that anybody would, make that claim at any point. All right, let's see. Other things that are in pocket or have been sent along via the KITM hashtag. Oh, I did want to note for the record that yesterday our good friend Ricky the Kanakistani, using the old Bird site still, had commented on my discussion with Greg about the weirdo European parliamentarian from Germany who showed up in Canada and then was later disavowed by the Canadian politicians with whom she met. Ricky, a Canadian herself, was saying that it's not really all that surprising that the Conservative MPs up in Canada were meeting with a right-wing nut job, or RWNJ, since they themselves are mostly RWNJs. So, yeah, you got to keep that in mind. But I guess they're not quite as, I don't know what. They're not the same sort of free-range nut jobs that you find either here in the United States or I guess in Germany as well, because they were still embarrassed and worried about appearing like right-wing nut jobs, which at least is, you still have that going for you, Canada. But a good point, and maybe we ought to take it with a grain of salt. And it's not that they disagreed, it's that they still have a system in Canada whereby people can be shamed for this sort of thing. But certainly right-wing nut jobs in Canada are working hard every day to bring the American system of ignoring that shame to bear on their politics. Okay, so let's see. In Russia-Ukraine news, I guess I will add this, although it's not my area, but Patrick Snyder had passed along something with the line here that this seems important. And if it seems important to you, then it'll seem important to us, I think, even though I'm not certain I understand the importance of it, but perhaps by reading a little bit about it, we will. Breaking news, he passes on from a Twitter denizen by the handle of pstyle1, and then 1. It's a Pstyle, Pstyle, ONE, numeral 1, who says, in breaking news fashion, the attack in Belarus at an airfield, which one? Machulichi, I don't know. Machulichi is the way it looks like, but I'm saying it like it's Machu Picchu. Machulichi. And if you're a close observer of what's going on, and in particular the peripheral activity in Belarus, then you might already know about the attack on this airfield. I don't, but it may have caused the death of the hero of the Russian Federation, who would then not be our hero necessarily, Colonel Nikolai Kolpakov. Not a familiar name for me. Picture of the guy right here. Looks like plausibly a hero of the Russian Federation. I don't know. He, in addition to 7 other people, may have died in this attack. Confirmation pending. It says here that the attack was caused by 2 drones, reportedly. And is there more information about it? It says the next tweet in the thread says, see here for context. And it's his own tweet, this P-Style one, who points out that, yes, the attack were launched by drones. The participants of the operation are Belarusians, and they are now safely outside the country. So I guess what it looks like is that Russian, a top Russian military official killed in an attack on a airfield in Belarus, and that it was natives of Belarus who conducted the attack. This despite the fact, I guess this is why it seems significant, Belarus ostensibly on a government-to-government level aligned with Russia even during its attack on Ukraine, even though I think it's also pretty widely expected by many rank-and-file Belarusians that they, too, will eventually be invaded and re-annexed by an expansionist Russia. But their governments are aligned to the extent that they are governments. And so that may be what was motivating, I guess. I'm sure they consider themselves to be patriotic Belarusians helping launch this attack and then fleeing the country to where no one knows, perhaps Ukraine. But we'll put that on the record as another weird angle on what's going on in that region of the world that not all of us completely understand. And as a matter of fact, also parked in pocket is another opportunity for a relatively long read on the another of the Central European historical complications surrounding the Ukraine situation that perhaps we can share and use this opportunity to get a little bit of insight into the weirdness and vagaries and subtleties of the Central European political picture in much the way we do here with our domestic picture for foreign listeners. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, how about some foreign policy esoterica as we prepare? This is our last segment prior to checking in with Joan. But hey, maybe she's interested in this from a foreign policy perspective, or we could say palate cleanser before we dive back into our domestic politics. But right at the end there, as we were heading into break, I was saying, it's interesting to remind yourself every once in a while of the fact that, as Greg always says, all politics are local, and even for politics outside of the United States, that appears to be true. Isn't that amazing? But every once in a while, when we think about how the level at which we parse our own politics, it's something that we have an innate understanding of because we're political junkies. And a reminder, most Americans have no sense of any of this because they don't care, or even if they do care, I don't know, maybe it just doesn't make any sense to them. But there are certain among us who parse these things and enjoy doing it and understand the subtleties and the nuances to all this stuff. And every once in a while, you might not even consider yourself some sort of political expert or anything, but every once in a while you run into somebody who makes it clear, you really do kind of understand this stuff at a level that others just don't or didn't before, and maybe they're having their eyes open to it, maybe not. But I don't know. It comes to mind because I ran into something the other day that reminded me of it really is something of a remarkable feat, for instance, for the Russians to have pulled off what they did in terms of election interference or misdirection of the American electorate, some portion of the American electorate. It's amazing that they could evidence enough understanding of American politics are as complex as any. But politics everywhere, inside this country and outside, all equally subtle everywhere. Although, sometimes politics is settled more by brute force but the idea that local actors, have their nuances, and this one comes to our attention for having done some spectacular thing, but we don't know all of the background of the person. And, if you jump to conclusions about whether or not that is a good politician or a bad politician, person we like, person we don't like, there's lots we might not know. They might take positions that surprise us if we know the entirety of their political positions. But for the story we read, in that context, that's all there is. But you might say, read a story about a Ukrainian politician and who does something particularly brave and say, that's what a great person. And you may find out later on, yeah, but did you know that they were anti-abortion on that question in Ukraine? No, that had never occurred to me. I didn't. Okay, well, interesting. Now we have the context. And it was always amazing to me that Russians could even get to the level, given the language and cultural barrier, that they could understand even basic, American political motivations and try to steer things. And to the extent they were successful with it, it was usually with people who themselves are Americans but don't understand the subtlety of things, not in every case. But, like, for instance, I've run into people on social media who say, well, I'm not American, but, I'm a keen observer of American politics. And the truth is both parties, they both support the war machine. Okay. Yeah. To some extent, sure. Yes. But I think, for instance, in this particular instance, it was somebody who was saying how interesting it was to them that the positions of the parties had flipped entirely on war. Well, if both parties sort of support the war machine, then there's no flipping them, for one thing. But okay, how do you mean? And the answer was, well, a few years ago, Democrats were the ones who were objecting strenuously. We cannot get involved in the Iraq war, for instance. That, I think, a tremendous oversimplification of the Democratic Party's position on the Iraq war. There were plenty of Democratic cheerleaders for the Iraq war, for one thing. But then the conclusion this person was reaching was that, isn't it odd that the Republicans were all pro-Iraq war and, more so than the Democrats, but certainly you could find people who were of a different mind if they were at the fringes. That's certain. But anyway, this person's assertion was that, it's flipped 180 degrees now, and Democrats are the pro-war and Republicans are the anti-war group. Well, to the extent that the anti-war group maintains a system of private, politically motivated, politically aligned militias who are perpetrating murderous attacks on Americans, well, I don't know. I wouldn't call them the party of peace at this point. But this person was arguing, well, they are anti-war in that they don't want the United States involved in Ukraine. Okay, that's anti-involving American troops in war, but that's not anti-war. There's still a war going on there, and to the extent that the United States stays away from it entirely, they perpetuate the Russians' war in Ukraine. That's not an anti-war position. But neither is it a pro-war position necessarily, but it's and it's no anti-war position, of course, for the Democrats to say we will help Ukrainians conduct a war because the Russian war was an aggressive war and we're fighting for the good kind of war. War is war, that's true. But the idea that as an outside observer, you could say, well, how interesting it is that the position of the parties have flipped entirely in 10 years. Whereas an American observer would say, nothing's really flipped at all here. Talk about being 180 degrees out of sync with what's happening. I think you're out of sync with I don't, that's not bad or wrong. It's difficult to understand the nuances of another country's politics. Even if it is the United States and you observe it because we force our news on everybody else out there, or the only way to survive out there is to keep one eye on what stupid things we might be doing. And I can understand that. And they probably have a better understanding of American politics than we have of Belgian politics. but still. Anyway, I'm wasting time here. I meant to get around to just, again, how fascinating it is to know historical background and to see things filled in. And sometimes it turns on a light bulb over your head when you're considering what's happening in the modern context. Sometimes not, and sometimes it's just fine to know the history. I have here before me, at the suggestion of the author, Evan Corin, who I guess is listening to the program, which I don't know if I was fully aware that he was listening, but he's a longtime Netroots denizen, from whom I would hear from time to time about any number of subjects. And this time, though, I don't think foreign policy and European history in this manner. But he has this interesting background to give us that I think it's worth the time. It's a diversion from the day-to-day politics, true. But hey, we like to do that here. Ukraine-Polish-USA relations in historic context. He writes in his Substack here, Snapshot with Evan and Julie. Although this one is just Evan. Although I don't know whether maybe Julie helped on this one. But that's the full name of it. Snapshot with Evan and Julie.substack.com in case you're looking for it. If you just want to click on a link, of course, look for Scott's summary later on today. Ukraine, Polish, USA relations in historic context. In 1772, remember the time of the founders and all that sort of stuff? A year before the Boston Tea Party, for context, a country with an elected king. I think we don't learn a great deal about the fact that they had such things, although you might wonder about the electoral process and who's got plenary power to do what and what did they declare ahead of time, et cetera, or how far does the franchise extend. But a country with an elected king and a parliament stretched from the Baltic Sea, way up north, right, to the banks of the Dnipro River south of Kiev. Does anybody? Evan knows the geography of it, but maybe the rest of us consult the map. It's okay. Who was it? This was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which for several hundred years was one of Europe's largest and most populous countries. And it helps put the United States in some context too, right? Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, never heard of it. You don't learn about it. Maybe they make mention of it in European history courses, but we barely even teach European history courses anyway. Maybe they did make mention of it. Many things that just didn't stick. I don't know. But again, several hundred years. We're in our 200 and something years here. There's several hundred. That implies, I don't know how long that went on. But at any rate, for a long time, there were many millions of people who were pretty sure that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was as permanent and as open and democratic, I suppose, a society as we think ours is. And it's gone now. And one day people may think the same thing of the United States if we're not careful. Anyway, this was, as we said, for several hundred years, one of the largest and most populous countries. Ukraine had a complex relationship with this major European power, such a dominant power that less than 100 years earlier, it had stopped the Ottoman Empire's advance into Europe by breaking the siege of Vienna in 1683 and rescued the Austro-Hungarian monarchy from destruction. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a significant power, it seems. Ukraine had been an independent country many times before the Polish-Lithuanians had showed up in its neighborhood, and the Ukrainians routinely attempted to reestablish an independent Ukraine, which I guess they didn't have in the shadow of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, shifting between fighting and allying with the Polish-Lithuanians, but also the other actors in the region, the Russians and the Ottomans. It was a tough neighborhood to live in. As the 1700s had progressed, Russia realized they could use the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's democratic institutions against them. What? In the 1700s, how could they? Particularly a parliamentary provision called the Liberum Veto, Liberum, and I'm sure you can Google that. And that I've heard of, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But don't worry about it. Evan puts his finger on it. The liberum veto that allowed any individual member of parliament, I mean, this is nuts. Listen to this. Any individual member of parliament to at any point in the legislative session veto all legislation passed during that session. What? Basically, as he says here, Chuck Schumer's worst nightmare of parliamentary rules. Russia realized that was extremely dumb, for one thing, and that they could control Poland, Lithuania, as a result, by buying one member of the parliament. I mean, that's a dumb rule. But I mean, it clearly didn't contemplate, what if a foreign power just bribes one of our members of parliament and causes chaos? But there's a lot to that. One, the context, Russia does this stuff and always has done this stuff. And, I don't know, it might not even be uniquely Russian. It works. So it probably isn't uniquely Russian. But the fact is that Russia's done it before. And, so when you're asking yourself, well, how likely is it that they would do that now? The answer is they've always kind of done it because they realized early on that it works. So in 1764, it continues, Catherine the Great of Russia did a couple of things. 2 bullet points about Catherine the Great at this point. One, she stamped out the last remnants of an autonomous Ukrainian country, 1764, and got her 32-year-old lover, Stanislav, I guess we would say, Stanislav Antony Poniatowski, Poniatowski, in English Western lettering, got Stanislaw here elected King of Poland. And, by the way, Grand Duke of Lithuania. So, interesting, right, that they had the elections for king. How fascinating. Well, what if Russia can use the liberum veto by buying one individual member of parliament to bring the Polish-Lithuanian parliament to a standstill? And even better, what if, since the king of Poland is an elected position, what if you could manipulate the election such that you could control the elected king of Poland as well? Poniatowski turned out to be a Polish reformer, including trying to get rid of the liberum veto, which is a good idea, and made Catherine the Great extremely unhappy. So she chose poorly there, and I'm sure she feels a little bit like they said George Bush felt about David Souter, having named him perhaps to the Supreme Court. But that's an interesting play. It just didn't work out the way she wanted. And you might think, wow, Catherine the Great manipulates this thing, gets her 32-year-old lover elected King of Poland. He must be a real jerk. But as it turns out, he's like, you know what? This liberum veto is quite stupid. We should try to get rid of it. Oh, no, that's actually quite good. So nuance. In the year 1772, 8 years after the Russians stamped out the last remnants of an autonomous Ukraine, the Russians teamed up with the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and Prussia, the country that would ultimately unify Germany, to start slicing up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. James Madison, people we understand now, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, writing in the Federalist Papers, in this case Federalist number 19, described what happened next. They were observing this in real time. If more direct examples were wanting, they said, in arguing in favor of their constitution, Poland, as a government over local sovereigns, might not improperly be taken notice of, nor could any proof more striking be given of the calamities flowing from such institutions. Equally unfit for self-government and self-defense, it has long been at the mercy of its powerful neighbors, Poland, Lithuania, who have lately had the mercy to disburden it of 1/3 of its people and territories. In other words, a democratic, an ostensibly democratic country, polity, could nonetheless be easily disassembled if it did not have a government capable of robust decision-making and I guess something like a liberum veto pretty much guaranteed that you would never have a robust decision making. But they probably thought it was quite wise. They were unifying a number of disparate regions and peoples and wanted to protect everyone's rights, and they overprotected and in the end gave themselves no ability to operate or defend themselves. James Madison, oh, by the way, there's some notes here. This was one of the few Federalist papers that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are considered to have written together. Madison and Hamilton were writing at that point in 1787, 15 years after the first partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For them, those were contemporary events, similar to someone today writing about, say, the 2008 global financial crisis. It was that close in time. By 1776, 4 years after the first partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we think of 1776 as a different agenda, but that was 4 years after the first partition of the Commonwealth. Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians would come to fight in the American Revolution in 1776, right? Their actions were similar to fellow American revolutionary fighters, Lafayette, of France, of course, and Americans today. I don't know if this is a direct comparison or not, but Americans today, such as Malcolm Nance, who have joined Ukraine's armed forces, but you get the idea. This is a fairly frequent happening, actually. They came to fight, of course, in a cause that they believed in and helped to train the forces they joined. One of the Poles was Casimir Pulaski, who has been called the father of the American cavalry. And if you don't believe me, there's a link to people calling him that. Another Pole was the Polish Jew, Chaim Solomon, who had immigrated to New York in the early 1770s and later lived in Philadelphia and helped secure the funds for the Yorktown campaign that led to America's victory in the American Revolution. Another, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was of mixed Polish, Ukrainian, and Lithuanian ancestry. Kosciuszko was a military engineer that fought at different points under Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, Major General Philip Schuyler, Major General Horatio Gates, and Major General, all Major Generals here, Nathaniel Greene. In July of 1777, as American forces fled south towards Saratoga, retreating from Canada, with the British forces threatening to take over to overtake them, Schuyler ordered Kosciuszko to slow the British advance. So some more military tradition here. Again, Kosciuszko mixed Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian. Kosciuszko used the same tactics that Ukrainians used just a year ago to thwart the Russians from capturing Kyiv. They destroyed bridges and blocked roads with trees and other obstacles and slowed the British enough for the Americans to reconstitute themselves as a strong fighting force near Saratoga. Kosciuszko then led the effort to select the terrain that the Americans would fight on and design the American fortifications for the Battle of Saratoga, which would be the first major American victory in the American Revolution, a victory that would ultimately lead France to enter the war to help the Americans. This part of our history, I think, at least we do mostly remember. Kosciuszko would go on to be the designer of many American military fortifications, including designing the fortifications of West Point. Kosciuszko would also lead the American military engineering efforts in the Southern campaign against General Cornwallis, arranging the American forces' crossing of rivers and destroying ways the British could cross rivers, selecting routes, campsites, supplies depots, gathering intelligence, and selecting the site at Guilford Courthouse, where American forces re-engaged the British forces. These efforts had a direct impact in bringing Cornwallis to his defeat at Yorktown. Kosciuszko would also be promoted to brigadier general, and there is a statue of him in Lafayette Park, one of the 5 statues in Lafayette Park, right in front of our own White House. He would also be one of the founding members of the Society of the Cincinnati, along with Alexander Hamilton. In 1784, after the end of the American Revolution, Kosciuszko, with the help of Chaim Solomon, returned to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As Polish-Lithuanian reformers tried to fix the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's gridlocked political system, Kosciuszko was part of that reform effort. In addition to political reforms, he advocated for reforms to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's military based on his experience in the American Revolution. And in response to this, he was made a general of the Polish military. On May 3rd, 1791, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became the second country in the world to enact a written constitution. Sounds like a good idea, right? This, of course, further upset Catherine the Great of Russia, and in 1792 she and Prussia seized more of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in what became known as the Second Partition. Afterwards, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was reduced to one-third the size it was in 1772. Kosciuszko, along with King Poniatowski's nephew, led the Polish-Lithuanian forces trying to resist the Second Partition and Russia's continued aggression. Much of the initial fighting happened in present-day Ukraine, near Kiev. Kosciuszko had success against the Russians on the battlefield, but King Poniatowski, and I hope I'm pronouncing that anywhere near correctly, struck a deal with the Russians in the end to agree to the Second Partition. In March of 1794, Kosciuszko launched an uprising that attempted to push out the Russian forces. Unfortunately, he had started the uprising earlier than he originally planned, at a time when his forces were still unprepared, because Russian intelligence had gotten wind of it and started arresting prominent Polish-Lithuanian leaders. By October of 1794, Kosciuszko's forces were defeated, and he was captured by Russia. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austro-Hungary completed the third and final partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, ending the existence of a Polish or Lithuanian country for the next 123 years, until they had a briefly independent Ukraine emerge after the collapse of the partitioning powers in World War I. Kosciuszko was released from Russian prison in 1796 after Catherine the Great passed away, and he returned to the U.S. via Stockholm and London. In 1798, Kosciuszko returned to Europe, the third time, to join Polish troops in Napoleon's army that were fighting in Napoleon's army, and in hope that Napoleon would defeat the partitioning powers and reestablish Poland. I don't know if that was a great bet. Kosciuszko became disillusioned by Napoleon after Napoleon briefly set up a puppet Duchy of Warsaw that to Kosciuszko was not an independent and democratic Poland. In 1817, Kosciuszko would pass away at the age of 71 at his home in exile in Switzerland. To this day, he is one of the most celebrated heroes in Polish history. Now, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine would each reemerge as their own independent countries in the brief aftermath of World War I. Well, long aftermath, but in the brief period from 1917 to 1919. Tragically, they fought each other as much as they worried about the successors to the partitioning powers, the now USSR and unified Germany. Many Ukrainians saw the Poles as former occupiers. Isn't that interesting? And one of the subtleties you might have missed in all of this, and this is interesting. Poland had a very expansive notion of what the boundaries of a reborn Poland should be, with claims that overlapped the claims of their neighbors. It was a case study of how Woodrow Wilson's notion of organizing international boundaries based on nation states didn't align with the facts on the ground of who lived where. A nation state is when the boundaries of a country align with the boundaries of an ethnicity. Throughout the world, populations of different ethnicities have always lived intermixed. It is the most common state in world history, and one that a post-Wilson worldview has a hard time contemplating. Wilson, a product of the U.S. South, was ignoring the facts that had surrounded him his whole life, and imposing as the defining organizational notion of international boundaries a Southern idealized notion of ethnic segregation. This, while at the same time ignoring that the segregated society he idealized would not function or exist without African Americans doing most of the work and existing within the South. This Wilsonian notion would help spur on a century of ethnic cleansing, as those who sought power would try to create ethnically homogeneous areas where none had ever existed, because legitimacy in Wilson's nation-state international order was based on the boundaries of countries and ethnicities aligning. Actually, the big plan for peace, actually quite dangerous, as it turns out. The 13th of Wilson's 14 points, in which he laid out the U.S. objectives in World War I, was an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, etc., etc. But you get some idea here of what's driving his view of what a nation really is. Ethnic groupings. Interesting. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio in the middle of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We will suspend with the reading of the story, and it's fascinating, and I think, I know a big departure from, modern day and American politics, but you can see the weird tie-in, and of course, Evan was going to get there eventually to make it, to tie it to modern American concepts, and I'd say fascinating. I'm going to give you a link to that, of course, in Scott's Roundup. Those of you interested can continue on in the reading. I may return to it later on.
Give us the shortcut, though.
Okay. Well,
it relates to modern.
Oh, well, what I thought was of interest in all of this, and by the way, everybody, here's Joan.
Hi, everybody.
There you go. I was just sort of, we were entering into it by way of the end of World War I and the Wilsonian idea of, this ideal with, we learn in high school, the League of Nations, it didn't work out, but fantastic. What a wonderful, idea. And so democratic and establishing America as a leader and pushing for democratic principles. One of the things they were pointing out is Wilson, comes along with this idea of, well, let's, draw up boundaries in Europe for peace, by dividing up into countries, nation states, basically drawing the borders along ethnic lines, with the idea in mind that, well, if we can separate, if each ethnicity sort of has its own area, then they won't be fighting all the time. They'll have their own territory and, self-determination and all that. And it's certainly an interesting concept, but they do point out, well, historically, that just really hasn't ever happened. Societies are intermixed all the time, and drawing the borders that way is maybe not practicable, but where does an idea like that come from? And it comes from a person who is a product of the American South, which itself is intermixed in many ways, but that doesn't matter to the people running the place, because just one of the ethnicities is entirely subjugated, and you forget about it when you're drawing up rules to govern it, because they don't matter. those people. And then to bring that to Europe in the name of peace and to say, to hell with certain ethnicities, this one is going to be, this group and that's going to be that group and they're all going to be there in the name of peace, which then, of course, as he's explaining things here, leads then to what do you do when it's not the ground truth inside of your borders? And the answer, as it turns out, unfortunately, in some portions of Europe over various periods of time in the modern era, is ethnic cleansing. After all, it was the brilliant idea of Mr. Peace, Woodrow Wilson, who told us, and as it turns out, one of Wilson's famous 14 points that were sort of taught about in high school government and history, and one of the points is is quoted here: an independent Polish state should be erected which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations. This is kind of the big peace plan has an ethnic cleansing component to it. Maybe we didn't learn about that part. So by the way, I guess we could relate it this way. This isn't what Evan is necessarily doing, but you could relate it to what's happening now. Are there extraordinary dangers, sometimes evident, sometimes less than evident, in monkeying with the way we teach history in this country? And maybe it's not such a super great idea to scream CRT at everything and say, let's not talk about the reality of our history. Let's talk about a fake version of our history so that we continue making these same stupid mistakes over and over again. Yeah, that could be problematic.
Interesting point.
Okay. We'll take that. I hadn't
considered the Balkan Wars in that context.
Yeah,
but,
right. We right. It all relates. We meddled in it afterwards, and we hadn't put our own house in order yet. And then we infected Europe with the ethnic cleansing bug, and then they sent it back to us.
Well,
like COVID.
No, the ethnic cleansing bug had been in Europe for a very long time.
Yes, this was not a new idea, but this was a sort of a imposing a new modern-looking legalistic framework to it, as opposed to kill all your neighbors, because what the hell? Now it was like, well, this document says you should kill your neighbors.
Because a league of your whole neighbors, a league of all of the nations say that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, we have problems. And we have problems in this country, too. Have you been aware of that?
I have, actually.
I knew it.
Kind of one of the things that I keep tabs on.
Right. So, what's happening? They came back.
Well, we had Supreme Court opinions this morning.
I missed that.
Luckily, none of them, really vital.
Okay.
One that says no, Delaware can't steal all of the money from all the other states.
Okay.
I think it's rather narrower than that. It's Delaware being the financial services hub of the nation, and when MoneyGrams are not claimed because they originate in Delaware, Delaware says Delaware is where MoneyGram is headquartered.
I see. So when they're unclaimed,
so Delaware says it gets to have all of the unclaimed MoneyGram money, even if the MoneyGram order came from another state. So, and the Supreme Court says no, you don't get to do that. But it was Ketanji Brown Jackson's first majority decision, so that was kind of fun.
Well. Okay, then. That's good news all by itself. Bad news for Delaware, but they're doing fine. They'll be okay.
Delaware is not going to be in tough shape at all.
They're going to be okay. So, all right, that's interesting. Good, not a worrisome nail biter. I assume there's some dangling out there, though.
We have, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, the independent state legislature.
Oh, boy, yeah, that's right.
When it actually came before them this fall in arguments last fall, they were a little less enthusiastic about it than they'd been previously.
Okay.
When it came to, actually having to put pen to paper and saying, yes, we think this totally whack job idea is really the thing, they were a little more cautious about it. So I'm not terribly worried about it. but at the same time, you have to worry about it because it's the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and of course, there's always the possibility. When this thing was circulated, this Cleta Mitchel deposition was being circulated again recently, and people were saying, "Wow, she's angling for appointment to the federal judiciary, whether there's a Supreme Court nomination in the future from if there's ever another Trump presidency, or for that matter, a DeSantis presidency." Would they do something would they put somebody on there who had this even more expansive view of the independent state legislature theory than most do? And how dangerous would that be?
Mm-hmm. Going into arguments, you had 3 who were pretty much proponents of it. Mm-hmm. Kavanaugh, Thomas, Alito.
Okay.
They were pretty much down with it. You had Gorsuch sort of curious about it, and Barrett completely unknown. So, there could be 5 going into the arguments on it last fall. There was the real thought that there could actually be 5. But in the arguments, they were more measured. So, I missed Thomas. Thomas is in there too.
I think you mentioned him in the first round. The group of 3 that you mentioned at first.
Yeah. So we'll see. But
yes.
I don't think that they're going to be that radical. And we've been seeing thus far, we haven't had huge cases come down, but there have been some really odd combinations. Like the second case they released today, it was on the Bank Secrecy Act. I don't, it's not something I had been following closely, but the dissent, the 4 dissenting are Barrett, Thomas, Sotomayor, and Kagan. And this is sort of the opinions released this year. We've seen some they've either been unanimous or really had bizarre pairings of justices on either side. It's just intriguing how diverse the opinions have been in terms of who's saying what.
Well, maybe they should replace the bench that they're on. It has a nice curve to the bench as it is, but if they made it like more of a horseshoe, this would make more sense.
Yes, it would.
Although much more intimidating to stand in the middle of that. Just for the parties arguing before the court, I think. But okay. And yeah, that is an interesting pairing. I wonder if we'll see more of that or not. I mean, it depends on the issue, more obviously.
Controversial cases come? Quite possibly, yes.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, we'll keep an eye on it. I'm glad that they were more measured in their approach to the independent state legislature thing than, say, Cleta Mitchel was. That was a super robust theory, I think. More so than, but that's the danger of it, is everybody has their own interpretation, because it's not a real theory. There's no unified understanding of what it is because it's not real and it hasn't been taught anywhere. It was just sort of kind of made up recently, or at least revived recently. And, if you are arguing it in theory, I guess you can be a little more measured in it. But if you're fighting desperately against all odds and all reason to reinstall Donald Trump in the presidency, then you just make up your own version of it. It says, it just says in the Constitution that Donald Trump has to be president. I don't know why everybody doesn't understand that.
Just make it simple for everybody.
Yeah, it says that. It doesn't say that. I know, but I'm saying it does. Well, and then at the end she said, hey, look, I'm just a lawyer and we disagree. I happen to think that Donald Trump's name is in the Constitution. You think because no one else can see it that it's not there, and that's wrong. Oh, all right. Whatever, Cleta.
Whatever, Cleta.
Yeah. I don't know what to tell you.
The other thing, it's also a big day in the Supreme Court because they're looking at Biden's student loan forgiveness.
Okay.
And that probably won't go well for Biden. Or, for that matter, everybody with student loans.
Oh, well, yeah, that would be the worst part.
Probably more important.
Yes, I think they're probably more nervous than he is. But he's nervous on your behalf. He wanted to help you.
Yes. And has so far.
Yes. Well, okay, yeah. What are the implications of it going the wrong way? I mean, it's not everybody give the money back or pay more, is it? I mean, I don't know what's at stake, really.
It's been forbearance, so do they owe all of this money again?
I don't know. I guess.
To be honest, I haven't.
Not.
I've sort of put that on the back burner to really dig into because I'm probably going to have to after the.
Yeah, well, once the decision is made, okay.
But here's just pulled it up on CNN Politics, their live updates. It started off with Justice Thomas kicking off the questioning, so that probably is not a good.
When did he learn to start asking questions? It's last couple of years. He's just all of a sudden now he's on a tear.
Yeah, when they got the clear majority is when he decided he would start speaking up.
Huh. All right. Very brave of him. He's just silent in the minority. And all right. Well, I don't know what to make.
I still don't really understand the standing here of Republican-led states. Or who brought the case. Do they really lose the revenue if it's federally guaranteed student loans? I don't get how they could even bring it. Yeah. But,
Well, standing jurisprudence is a guessing game because if they want it, they take it. And if they don't want it, they pretend they can't have it. And
so the issue is whether the Department of Education has the authority to actually do this. And it's an Iraq War artifact. When the Bush administration said, okay, and Congress agreed with legislation, all of these people fighting the war, this is an extreme circumstance. Okay, let's forgive at least a portion of their student debt. And that was used, the HEROES Act, I think they called it, and that was used to say, okay, global pandemic, that's kind of another big emergency situation. Yeah. You have relief to these borrowers, and it's borrowers making less than $125,000 per year, $250,000 for households. So, making them pay their student loans living in this catastrophe is kind of mean. So,
yeah. Well, to say the least. Okay. Well, we'll see how this one comes out. I was wondering, how does that stem from the Iraq War? I'm just not versed in the background of the case, but that makes sense. And let's see. I also note that, something from this past weekend that you had written about, I don't know whether you want to make this segue or not, but about Judge Kaczmarek, the Texas. We've been talking about the weird method by which and probably really unlawful, unconstitutional, honestly, at some level, the way Texas parses up its federal district judges and judgeships such that you can now just select the judge you need to overturn longstanding authority or whatever it is. Anytime, if you want to bring the independent state legislature case before Cleta Mitchel specifically, this is the sort of thing you can do now by dividing up these districts the way they did.
Right. You go to two places in Texas, Amarillo, and I can't remember the other one.
Abilene.
Because Kaczmarek is Amarillo.
Oh, okay.
And you get a judge who was seated by Trump and who is demonstrably a right-wing nut job.
Tells everybody as much.
And, on everything.
Yeah.
LGBTQ issues, on absolutely everything. He is extreme as you can get. And he's also young. He's in his 40s.
Yes, right.
So anyway, first of all, you want to go to the Fifth Circuit.
Yes, they built.
So your best bet is always going to where the last batch of crazy right-wing nut job circuit court judges sit.
Yes.
So you start in Texas, and you best go to Amarillo so you can get Kaczmarek, and then, when it's appealed, it'll go to the 5th, and you'll probably get a very friendly judge there, and so it'll go to the Supreme Court. It's the express lane.
Yeah.
Doing things like getting abortion rights overturned.
Yeah. And things that often have very little political support anywhere in the country, or certainly most of the country, or just this is why we kept seeing crazy things like, hey, a judge in Texas from, nobody in Texas has overruled Obamacare and is going to, wants a nationwide freeze on healthcare benefits for millions and millions of people. Even prior to Dobbs, there's a federal judge in Texas for some reason says
Reed O'Connor.
All abortion is unconstitutional.
Reed O'Connor on the Fifth Circuit.
Mm-hmm.
He's been sort of I'm having a hard time finding my words today. Steamroller.
Okay.
For progressive policies, first with the Obama administration and now with Biden. So he's the most reliable on the Fifth, and likely to be on any 3-panel of judges, who get the nod to decide things.
Yeah. At least there's a chance of rolling the dice and getting a different panel they still have to stick to that on the Fifth Circuit, but but it's so loaded.
Your chances are pretty good that you're gonna, the Fifth is gonna be the one that takes it to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So on this, Kaczmarek is deciding whether there will be an injunction on mifepristone, the abortion pill, which in some states, like Oregon, 60% of abortions, it's used. Nationally, it's more than half of abortions because it's safe, it's effective. It was particularly helpful during the pandemic for people to be able to have the procedure done without having to have a procedure done. They got
no surgery.
You could do it in the privacy of your own home.
Which is, ordinarily a big deal to conservative people, even if they don't like the thing that's being done.
Yes.
But, now he says, I don't know, I don't like it. So, and as I was reading the interesting profile of him the other day, that, essentially, like with most Republicans, he says, well, my sister had a baby, so I guess everybody should. She managed.
And again, this is one where the standing is pretty much non-existent. It's providers saying, they're not saying people are coming to me and, they've taken the abortion pills and they're dying and this is a huge problem. They're saying it could maybe happen.
Oh, okay. So potential injury?
Potential injury.
Yeah, not supposed to be the basis on which you can bring a federal case, really, unless, I guess you can try with the restraining order, but, very, more interesting, I think, for most of us was, well, one, the profile of this judge, and then two, this one weird trick that they use in Texas, but they're increasingly using, as I recall, in Florida as well. That's how, Trump got his, Pervolago documents case decided by that lunatic judge in Florida who ended up getting overruled. But the one who I can't even remember her name. For a while, I couldn't think of anybody else.
Eileen Cannon?
Yeah. But there too, they brought the case to a weird sub-district of Palm Beach where they were going to get either her or another loon.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, they get her over and over again. So
what I wrote over the weekend was sort of an interesting sleeper speech and a hell of a speech by my senator, Ron Wyden.
Right.
Saying, you
can
ignore this if you are the FDA. You can just say, this injunction is not valid for all of these reasons, and he laid them out really, really well in his speech. I've got a link to it in my post.
Okay.
You don't have to pay attention to this. You can say, you're wrong, and wait for the Supreme Court to tell you. what you should be doing about it.
It's certainly it's a tactic that's been used to a great extent in the past by Republicans, and that doesn't mean it's okay to do it necessarily if that's the excuse you're leaning on. But certainly, look, this is unsettled, and especially when these cases are initiated and steered to a particular judge with that purpose in mind. This is not what anybody had in mind when we were saying, okay, let's test our laws and our regulations in the court system and let an impartial judge and juries make these decisions. This isn't what anybody had in mind. Picking a judge purposefully who not only is an active abortion opponent or opponent of most progressive policies. Oh, your cuckoo was telling us something too.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's fast too.
Yeah, that's another thing. Hey, wait a minute. We have a few minutes left. But you can not only do your judge shopping, but also I should point out that I think a lot of these Texas judges, in addition to being alone in their districts, also have a weird proclivity for insisting that they have the power, as they do. But most district judges are hesitant to use it, to say, I'm issuing a nationwide injunction or a nationwide impact of my ruling, as opposed to saying, in this district, that will now be the prevailing ruling here, and the law as it exists, and maybe for the Fifth Circuit ought to, will likely uphold it. But they're extraordinarily, I think, aggressive in insisting that the one lone judge in a district so small that where there only needs to be one judge can make these decisions for the whole country. And I guess Wyden probably says, yeah, that's kind of garbage, actually.
That's kind of garbage, and we've got a problem with this, and it's kind of time to take that on.
Yeah. And they can do that. They can certainly reorganize the federal judiciary, and they don't have to give the states the ability to divide things up this way, or while they might want to give them some leeway to do it, they might have to do it within certain boundaries. Like, there really has to be a chance that another judge will get these cases.
Yes.
But, all right, in the meantime, we're stuck
with
that.
So that's an interesting thing to go watch.
Yeah.
Another thing that came up specific to the abortion pill was a suit by a dozen Democratic states against the FDA for really classifying this drug too restrictively, which has hindered access to an extent, but mostly it just makes it kind of dangerous for both doctors and patients, doctors prescribing it, patients taking it, because it creates a paper trail of, I am getting this drug to terminate a pregnancy, whether it's an actual abortion that you are seeking or whether it's to treat a miscarriage. You have to sign all of this paperwork saying, I am doing this, and that paperwork exists and it's in your medical record and can be used against you.
Sure. Yeah.
But also the big problem is that this drug, there are some 20,000 different pharmaceuticals that the FDA regulates. There are just 60 that have this more restrictive regulation on them. And there are things like heavy-duty cancer drugs. Fentanyl is one of them. Heavy-duty sedatives that they use for people who are, having manic episodes or who are in schizophrenic mode.
Okay, some of those make some sense.
So it really is not an appropriate designation for this drug because it has been proven to be so safe and effective and really doesn't need to be held out this way, and only is because it's abortion, which is icky. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure that's the reason. And they probably, all right. Well, I'm sure they said an abundance of caution.
Well, now, if you want to go back into the history, and this is something that I spent a lot of time with when I was working for Wyden when he was in the House, the FDA started basically discriminating against this drug when it was being used in Europe. It was RU 486 then. It's called
I remember that.
now.
Right.
They had an import alert on it under the first Bush administration. An import alert is a really, really rare thing for the FDA to use with medications. They pretty much only do it to keep out snake oil, really unproven, dangerous, weird stuff. They slap an import alert on it to keep it from coming into the United States and being used. That's what they did because, again, it was abortion. That's what they did to RU 486 back then.
Okay.
And with no evidence for doing so. It was going fine in the trials in Europe. It was being used. It was not killing people. It was an unnecessary burden.
No real reason for it, just, like you said.
So there's
abortion.
history with this drug and the FDA. And good for the Democratic AGs for taking it on.
Yeah.
It could end up being the thing that the Supreme Court ends up battling with over the drug. This case out of Texas, this suit with the FDA.
Yeah, well, I'll probably end up having to merge those cases, maybe decide them all at once. We will see about the timing and whether that presents itself. But thank you for the history on that as well. I always wondered, when did this happen? Is this a new drug or? Well, I remember the number because it was easier to say.
Yes, that was back in the 90s.
Yeah, and it's the same drug essentially, huh?
Pretty much,
okay.
Yeah. Mifepristone, yes.
Okay, well, I gotta get with the new terminology. This is the way this drug needs to identify now. All right. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Joan, as always, for coming by and tolerating our nonsense and still telling us what's going on.
I'm adding to your nonsense.
In some cases. I appreciate that. Okay. Well, thank you again for your patience, and we'll check in with you again next week when probably more rotten stuff will have had a chance to happen with Congress back in town. Yay. All right. See you then. Thank you.
EdwardsRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, well, thanks again, and thanks to all of you for putting up with Joan's fast cuckoo clock. I want to hear the cuckoo of that thing at some point. I don't know if there is a cuckoo. Anyway, there's a cuckoo coming up next, of course. Justice Putnam in the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy comes up next. He'll have plenty to tell you about what's going on with Fox and Dominion's lawsuit as well.